And we are live. So, hi everyone. I
Hi,
am
everyone.
I'm Matteo Collina, and this is a meeting for discussing the project proposal, project progression. I made it wrong. A project progression on the joint for the joint foundation. So. We have a packed agenda as usual, so why don't we start? And I will give the Jory. Can you start?
Yes, awesome. So just to recap this for everyone, and for those who may not be super familiar, the project progression proposal is, spiritually based off of the CNCF sandbox process and so on, for how different projects are basically categorized within the foundation, which is important for us to be able to understand what kinds of resources different types of projects might need, be they, say, travel fund or marketing support or, whatever. Those things vary by size and maturity of project. And so we want a progression process so that we can understand how a project moves maybe up and down depending on, or I shouldn't say up and down because it's not a hierarchy here. It's maybe moves from one bucket to another depending on the stage of the process, its life cycle, that kind of thing. So that's what this is in a nutshell. And we had a original proposal that, again, was just largely cribbed from the CNCF. And in that process of kind of saying, hey, what if we start here? We identified a few issues that are definite changes for the merged foundation. And I categorized those in the README on that proposal, and I've just basically copied them below so that we can look at them collectively, address them, and see if we can resolve anything to move this to potentially stage 2. One of the top issues was around open governance and whether we want to make open governance a requirement for top-level projects. And this was actually, I think, an issue that Matteo, you really brought up. And so I wonder if you want to start with sort of your perspective of this particular piece, so we can address it, because I think it's probably the biggest component.
Yes, of course. After muting my phone, it seems that whenever I started the YouTube stream, everybody seems to call me on my phone. I don't know, whatever. So it was fun. So yes, let me go through to my point very briefly. So one of the core tenets of the Node.js project and the Node.js project and overall of the Node.js foundation, at least on the technical side and the community side, whatever, after the board, is the fact that all of our governance is kind of open, and there is no there is a consensus seeking process. There is people can join things, get put into more and more positions. There's a growth path of individuals within the various organization. I'm not claiming that Node.js is actually perfect in this regard, but at least it's a working model, and it's also a statement. And there are a lot of other open source projects that are run most in where their governance is mostly hidden, or it's following a benevolent dictator model where there is a single individual making all those decisions. Now, if making those decisions means the problem is in a model where there is a representative of a project joining, potentially one or two representatives of a project joining the CPC. If those people are basically the benevolent dictator and his best buddy, then it's not compatible for all of our discussions that we had so far. So there is to be a group of people managing a project that they elect a representative, a chair, whatever you want to call them, and those people, and then there are those group of governance elect 2 representatives on the CPC. Otherwise, and then the CPC places somebody on the board, whatever, but that's a different story. Well, actually more than one probably. So this is more or less my my point, and why I don't think it's having anything that's not closed open governance. It's not compatible with all of our discussions so far.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for summarizing that background. And I think you also kind of touched on another reason why this is an important discussion that people may not have picked up on, which is that currently the plan is for each top level project to have 2 voting members from the project be represented on the CPC. So that's a good point to underscore there. So I think we had a little bit of an exchange also on that thread between some JS Foundation projects that wanted to kind of bring a different perspective. And I know we have Chris Hiller and Christian Broman and a few folks from the JSF also on the call today. So let me just take a second and see if one of them would like to kind of bring some perspective from the non-node world.
Hi, this is Chris Hiller. I guess my first question is, I'm wondering if the current top level JSF projects already have this model. And then my second question would be, do all of these how looking at the group of projects in the JSF, how many of them are going to have the resources to send 2 people to the CPC who are expected to be voting members? By that, I mean, do we have two people who have the time and energy to put into that? And, is that, does not having those people available mean a project cannot be a top level project? So that's kind of some just questions I have.
Those are really super good questions. So, I think if we take a look at the JS Foundation's top level, and mind you, we don't really call them top level projects, we call them graduated projects. These are projects that do have transparent and open participation, though they may not, they're not, of course, as big as Node. And so they tend to have participation in more like concentrated organizations, like, for example, SitePen and Dojo. So that I think is an example of a pretty active but mature JS Foundation project that I would expect comes in as a top level project, but doesn't have that sort of open scale to the degree that Node has in terms of numbers of participation. So, and all of these projects also have adopted codes of conduct and some of the other things that we look to indicate that this is, mature, functioning project that, is taking good care of its community. And so I think my question is, like, when we look at projects like that, is what we're saying that the path to this has to be clear, that the governance structure has to be clear, that the code of conduct has to be clear, or are we setting a requirement that there are metrics that say X% of a community or a maintainership group is from more than one company or something like that. I think at that point, we start to have a problem on the JS Foundation side, where that may not be true for some of our projects.
I do think that's a requirement from my point of view.
It's not a requirement from your point of view?
For me, it's a requirement.
Oh, it is.
So for me, for being a top level project in the new foundation, you should have more than one company contributing to it. Yeah. Like that's my view at least, and because that will grant the best chance of success to the project. I think to be as I say, top level. I'm not saying you can join. I'm only want to put those facts into the top on the top level projects themselves. Is not anything else. But if an open source project, in order to be successful within a foundation, if it's only a few number of individuals, if it's only one company sponsoring most of the development, then I don't really know what they're benefiting from being in the foundation.
You know, I wonder if this is a good, sorry to interrupt, Matteo. I wonder if this is a good opportunity to talk about the different levels that we're imagining, because it sounds like, you know, something like this may fall into a second level, perhaps. This is Giuseppe, by the way.
Yeah. Likely. It's, I don't have the current proposal for the levels out, but you can, Jory, you can probably go through them very quickly.
Yeah, so that's a little bit fluid as well at this point. Let me go just quickly take a look at the.
I think the CNCF one for the graduated projects had a requirement for multiple companies, and did it not?
Yeah, and I'd like to chime in and just plus one Matteo's opinion there. Like the point of the foundation is for project longevity, and if you're still supported by a single company, that doesn't necessarily indicate to me that there's stability there. So, and I do believe that there is precedent here with the CNCF guidelines. Like I remember a line item there requiring multi-company contributions and more than a couple contributors.
A question I have about that, would all of the current JSF projects be able to meet that requirement that are top level or the equivalent?
No.
Good question.
That this would represent a substantial change in their status. Because, I mean, we take a look at like Dojo, for example, they're very active within the JS Foundation, but you know, I'd have to take another look at their contributor list. I think it's largely folks from the SitePen organization with contributions from the community, but the technical management is largely done by SitePen employees, for example. JerryScript would be in the same boat. I think Node.red might be in the same boat. I don't know for sure, but
I think the wording was around.
Go ahead.
I was going to say.
Sorry.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was specifically asking about top level projects. I think there's 3 top level projects in the JSF, right?
So we don't have top level projects. We have we have graduated projects.
Right. Oh, so are all of those? I was under the impression that there were only 3 projects at that level. So are like Node.red and JerryScript and all of those at that level?
Yeah, I'm going to actually confirm that list right now.
So this is Brian. Yeah, so in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the requirement is just to have diversity of committers.
Right.
So that's what I was going to multiple organizations, and I'm looking at the commit statistics for JerryScript. JerryScript obviously is very heavy Samsung, but there are also commits from Intel, a small number of commits from Linaro. Node.red, of course, very heavily IBM with 28,000 lines of code from Hitachi. So if there are any that we have specific concerns about, I can run an analysis on them here. But it seems like those 2 in particular, you know, even though we look at them and think of them very heavy Samsung or very heavy IBM, those would meet the criteria.
The graduated projects are ESLint and Appium.
So Appium has, I mean, Sauce Labs did most of Appium, but Alibaba has contributed 3,000 lines of code. So
And I'm not really concerned about ESLint.
Yeah. I mean, even ESLint, NPM, and PayPal are both contributors.
Yeah.
So they would meet that. I guess what I'm saying is that particular bar is not all that high because it's really looking at diversity of contributors.
Yeah, and this might be a definitions issue on our part.
Right.
Like we said multiple companies.
I don't see. Sorry.
Diversity of contributors.
A clear important part is so there is two levels of this. One is diversity of committers, like contributors, but people with commit access. Okay, so full member of the project. Because if it has received some lines of code from Intel or whatever for a different company, that doesn't count. I consider it is the project run by a single entity. Okay, and if this question is yes, then that does not meet the. I think that does not set a good example and meet a good bar for the top level, not for everybody else. Okay, I just want to clarify this because it's important to say. I'm not saying the other one we need to kick them off. I'm just saying this is because that will ensure longevity and stability, and the fact that we can guarantee the project can guarantee its existence for a significant amount of time.
I would also like to raise kind of a counter to that. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but there's some pretty heavy examples where the most healthy ecosystems in our ecosystem are run by single entities. You can look at React, which is created and run by Facebook.
It's not an open source. It's not an open source project. React. Have you tried contributing? Sorry.
No, I haven't.
How many pull requests? How many React? How many pull requests? It's open source, like Android is open source. Okay.
Well,
sorry.
Matteo,
right, that's what I'm saying.
Can I just interject for 1 second? Matteo, I would like to make sure that we don't misuse open source and open governance. They're open source by all the OSI definitions. I don't think there's any benefit by kind of gatekeeping what open source is. If we want open governance to be, a fundamental bit of our foundation, that's kind of a different bit.
Yeah, that's my bit. Sorry, that's my bit. You're right.
You're
right. That's my bit.
What I was getting at with that comment, just real quick, is that if that is our line in the sand, that line can be erased pretty easily with other kind of examples. So I think we definitely need to build up some more definition around the various terms we're using here to make sure we're accurate and working towards something, a shared value.
So I want to plus one what Tierney's saying here, because, I think that from the JSF side, we, strongly support open governance. That's a good value to have. We also want to make sure that the value and the experience that our projects are bringing to the table in their varying states of maturity, because many of these projects have been around much longer than Node in some cases. We should be able to bring that to the table, regardless of whether right now they're being operated by, 1 or 2 persons or much larger groups.
So if I can interject a couple things that I think may be helpful. Like when we're talking about the cross-project council and the CPC, the direction in which we're talking about it going right now is a very open committee where anyone from any project within the foundation will be able to attend. Quite like how this meeting is being run, quite like how the Bootstrap meetings are being run. So I think fundamentally from a base layer there, any project that's coming into the foundation is going to have that representation of being able to participate in the consensus seeking there. The extra bit there would be voting. And my hope would be, although I know that you can't always take people at face value for this, would be that voting, when we're talking about voting for things at the CPC, that would be limited to top level projects. But as we see in Node itself, as I see at TC39, as I see at many consensus seeking organizations, voting primarily only comes up at the point in which consensus has been reached. So, while it may get controversial, especially around the times of new projects coming in or around private business that needs to be kept within, like only certain circles, I think the majority of projects that are coming in will be able to have be fully empowered without having to be a top level project. It is the first bit. So, I think it will be projects that want to engage in that process that will end up going down that path. Was it correct when I heard that there's only currently 2 graduated projects in the JSF? Did I miss?
So there are 2 graduated projects. Those are ESLint and Appium. And then there are several at-large projects, which include jQuery, Dojo, and Intern are probably the most active projects in the JS Foundation that are currently at-large projects. Some of the at-large projects would probably go into the emeritus stage. Just some brief discussions with some of those maintainers indicate that that's what they would prefer.
And what does at-large mean?
At-large is basically a grandfathered category of projects that haven't gone through the mentorship program because they were already pretty mature when the Dojo and jQuery foundations merged 3 or 4 or 5 years ago at this point. They can go into a mentorship program if they want, but they don't have to.
So I think that's perhaps the loaded question that I can ask right now, Jory. Are the projects in the JSF expecting to be grandfathered into positions similar to the ones that they're in right now? Is that a desire that projects have explicitly expressed?
So it's a mixed bag. As I mentioned, I've talked to some projects who anticipate saying, we're like Require.js, for example, is happy to move into the emeritus status. And we'll figure out, of course, exactly what emeritus status means. But there are some projects that expect to go there, and that's fine. But then there are other projects that have been active in JSF discussions and like participating and like being involved and want a seat at the table.
Are you able to share which projects those are?
Sure. I think Dojo is probably the most, the greatest example of this. The jQuery team, I think they like Access as well, but I also don't see them being super heavily participating in the CPC. I don't know. I think it would depend on what Timmy and Dave said.
By the way, I managed to show up. Sorry about the delay.
Hi, Dave.
So if you want, I'll chip in a little bit of information there. I don't think, at least in the JSF, one of the reasons why a lot of projects had not graduated is they felt comfortable with the level of participation they had. So that includes jQuery, it includes Dojo, but there's also, there are some goals to meet for open governance that I think, are important, that if somebody decides they want to participate in a kind of a higher level governance process, that they need to be willing to they need to understand they have to be willing to put some effort in. There's nothing wrong with saying our project is either, just minimal resources and therefore does not want to participate, or that we would prefer just to focus on our project.
So one thing that just kind of came to mind here, and someone interrupt me if this isn't a good idea, but maybe we could approach this kind of like in an inverted way. One of the things that we want is an engaged and successful CPC, which means we should be identifying who the projects are that want to participate. if we can identify the projects that actually want to be engaged and participate and elect members to the cross-project council, we could probably start from that subset and figure out, hey, what are the shared bits that make all these projects the same, and identify shortfalls if there are any, and kind of figure out the pulse of what's necessary. Because we can kind of talk about, and I'm not trying to state that any of these requirements are arbitrary, but we could start outlining all of these different like pie in the sky things that we'd like to have as requirements. But I think it would be a whole other thing to sit down and realize who are the stakeholders that will actually show up and help us do this work from day one. And, you know, what does it actually look like for those people?
So I agree that the really what we're talking about here is like having an engaged cross-project community that assists and supports each other, you know, regardless of whatever it is that our projects are really doing. And to me, that doesn't require, you know, super live. I don't think you have to be a member of a super active, you know, project in order to provide something there. And I think that's one of the concerns that I'm most worried about is the perception that the door is shut to those projects. The door to the CPC is shut to those projects because they're not big enough yet, or you know, they don't meet some definitions that we settled on here.
And I don't think that that's the intention, at least from the conversations and the drafts that are coming up. Any member of any project can participate in the consensus seeking process entirely at the CPC. So the only difference for top level projects is that they would be the voting members if something were to go to a vote.
I think that sounds right. I think everybody should be pretty open. And then it's really just a question of what are the criteria for top level members? You know, what is it that makes a top level member, and how do you measure that?
And I think back to the original, you know, kind of jumping off point, there seems to want to be a requirement for open governance, and we have to define what that means. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think some level of open governance, just as I came in, there was a mention made, for example, of React. You know, although they accept pull requests, are all the people who are React team members Facebook employees? If so, I think that would not meet a bar of open governance. So, you know, there are probably some really bright lines that we can easily determine if it is sitting in a company's organization. If it's sitting in an organization and it's, you know, it's the only committers are employees of that organization or contractors of that org, then I think it's pretty clearly not open.
I mean, I guess that I also have a question about this in terms of like, so there's a company that has a project. This project may or may not already have a lot of scope or, you know, adoption. There's a ton of examples of this. And they want to move it into an open foundation. I think that having guide rails for them would be very important because I don't think we should block because of that. You know, that project would obviously need to be moved into an independent GitHub org. Like, for example, you know, if you wanted to talk about the React example, it would need to move into like the React org or the React.js org. And then, you know, from there, be independent, like adopt open governance. You know, obviously, I'm not stating that React is going to do this or anything like that, but I'm trying to give an example of I think we need to be very, very open and willing to accept that because that is a path that is going to lead to success for us.
Right, and
Jamie, I don't think anyone's saying that they couldn't join the foundation.
Okay.
It's what the requirements are to be a top level project.
right.
Okay.
Right, like I think it's you can join the project at one of the levels, you know, almost regardless of what stage you're at. But at the top level, you need to have made a commitment to open governance, and then you know there needs to be the signs, which I think is what Dave was mentioning. You know, one of the clear signals that you are really committed to that and have been moving towards it is that you actually have full committers from more than one organization.
This
And then the
sounds
question,
fair to me.
and then the question is, like, at the other levels, are there any requirements? Like, do you need to join when you join to say, okay, well, we don't have open governance, but we're willing to commit to that? Or is it, you know, you could join as a BFDL at the, you know, the first level and say, well, I always want to stay that way. And that's fine too.
Well, I mean, the flip side too is if we look beyond governance, let's just look at like literal OSI open source definition. Would we allow anyone to join the foundation that has like a WTFPL license? And I'd say probably not from a legal standpoint. So I think that there will be like clear guidelines of expectations for certain levels that will get progressively, I guess, more opinionated as you graduate. Which I think is the whole process, the whole purpose of having that program to begin with. Yep. Is like we have a vision of what a successful, sustainable open source project looks like. And if you want to kind of buy into that methodology, there's a process for you to follow.
Yeah, and I do think that if you look at some of the JSF guidelines, those outline some of the things that you just mentioned, things like what licenses are preferred. And if you go beyond a certain, you know, if you're not talking about a handful of very open licenses, then it goes to the board to decide whether this is appropriate, whether it's a good idea for us to take on a project that has, say, a GPL license. So, you know, certainly when you get to legal issues, it gets a little bit trickier. But I also think that there's, you know, if you look at the JSF list, for example, we do have the mentorship process, like in a case like React. You could go, if React comes to us and says, we want to join, and we have a list of things, you know, of our process that we're going to immediately open up, and we've got some external contributors that we want to be on the team. You know, that period of time when you're not a voting member could be very short. So it's not necessarily that it excludes people. It's really just meant to encourage people that if they want to be active and want to be on some type of CPC, that they are going to follow kind of a best practice to get there.
So
I guess when talking, oh, Jory, please go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, and I may be beating a dead horse here, but I want to reiterate that my concern for these definitions is that we might be precluding the ability of smaller projects to have a voice. And, you know, that to me it's really important that we have a diversity of projects in the CPC making voting and taking voting decisions. So I think that's the thing I want to raise.
So,
right.
I see that I totally see your point, Jory. And however, this is, for me, it seems very, I don't know, a little bit complicated, because so if a project is small or not active, not very active, like, would they be willing to invest time in building the foundation? This is overall my, like, if a project is not thriving, is not growing anymore, is not whatever, will this project be willing to invest time in growing the foundation itself?
But I think
sorry.
yeah. there's a difference between thriving projects and like, you know, and small ones, right? So, you know, we have like WebHint, for example, is a very active project. You know, it's smaller than others, but they are very much interested in participating in the CPC and in the new foundation, despite their smaller size, and you know and I think would have a lot to add. So I would say they're thriving. I'd say there's probably an upper limit to how big that project will get, and that's okay.
So I guess my answer to that one would be, in the CPC charter that we're working on, there's other ways to become voting members. You know, first of all, we're trying to word it so that they're like anybody can become a member and participate in the regular work. So there wouldn't be a block on that perspective. Secondly, you know, we've attempted to make it that becoming a voting member, the only way that you become a voting member is not by graduating and becoming a graduated project. That's not the only way. The other ways are, you know, I'm trying to remember, I think I put in a couple seats that are elected based on the like the non-top level projects together. So that's a path, as well as currently as written, it includes the CPC nominating 2 seats from the CPC members themselves. So if somebody was very, you know, came to the CPC and could participate as a non-voting member, was very active, and you know the rest of the CPC could recognize them and also, you know, bring them to the voting level, if that wasn't, you know, if that made sense.
I think that's that makes sense. That does make sense to me.
So I think it's sort of like, you know, if you're big enough, okay, you get a voting representation, but there's these other paths that, like, you know, a bunch of small projects together can make a decision to send somebody who's very active, and then the CPC itself can also recognize, you know, involvement and participation.
I think it's just, I think the thing I'm hanging up on, y'all, is that this indication that the smaller projects, you know, aren't necessarily going to be contributing as much or have a need to contribute as much. I think, just as for background, I come from a small consulting company, Boku, and we, you know, really believe in the power of a lot of like of the small businesses, if you will, of the small projects to really bring a lot of value to an ecosystem like this. And I don't want to undervalue what those groups can bring to the table.
So for what it's worth, I entirely agree with that. I entirely agree with that. I mean, that's basically the entire premise that Node's ecosystem has been built around, is you know, small modules that do one thing.
No,
so project size.
I'm not hearing anything that's implying that small projects wouldn't be able to become a top level project, though, right? Like, I can think of a large number of small projects that would meet the definition of open governance, would meet the definition of contributors from more than one place. Jory, are there small projects within the JSF that as exists right now that we could use as a particular example of like whether or not they'd be able to participate as a top level project? Or are you thinking more like longer term about other projects we may look at bringing into the foundation?
I'm thinking about both, but I think right now, to me, this current definition that we don't really have actually around what makes a project, and if we're saying that a project needs to have an open governance, and we haven't defined what open governance is, I really can't, because we've talked a little bit about number of committers and contributions, and so I think an action item from this meeting needs to be that we kind of framework out a bit of what open governance means, so that we can say projects meet the requirement or don't.
Absolutely. And that's where I think earlier when I was suggesting working backwards could be a good place, because we could identify the projects that we think within our 2 foundations are good examples of openly governed projects. We can extrapolate features from them.
I mean, so for what it's worth,
shifting the tone of it.
Pardon?
Go for it, Jerry.
I was just gonna say, for what it's worth, I mean, I've talked to projects in advance of this, initially when we were doing this proposal, about, you know, where they think they will want to be and that kind of thing. And I don't think it's too many, there'll be too many, you know, surprises or requests, but it really does come down for these projects, like what is the definition of top level? What is the definition of, you know, sandbox and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And
so which projects want to elect people to participate as voting members on the CPC?
WebHint, Dojo are two that definitely have stated as such. I believe JerryScript, although I haven't talked with them. I believe WebDriver. I believe Mocha.
I just, in the chat, I just posted a link to a section on mentorship, which has some of the criteria we were using to determine when the project had graduated. And so it gives you a little bit of an idea of what we were thinking. It's not something that needs to be followed here, but it just gives you a thought about, I think we've been mentioning some of these things. And you know, having true open governance does require enough people regularly participating, enough diversity in the contributor base, et cetera. And so that might be a problem for a small project to make top level anyway. So the problem, depending on how you set the mentorship, essentially the graduation goals, the problem that we're talking about may not even exist.
By the way, I'm looking at the definition of graduated project in the JSF, and I can stand behind those values 100%.
Awesome. That's great.
I mean, and I guess, Jory, so the question might be to go back and see if those projects were expressing that desire, like, is the proposal we're making for the CPC makeup, you know, do they look at that and say, well, wait a sec, I'm not going to be able to get the representation involvement that I want, or no, yeah, that makes sense to them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Michael. And I think we need to, the JSF projects need to just spend some time with that and make sure it makes sense. I don't know that they have spent the time necessary to be able to make that assessment right out. And so I'll make sure that they do that.
Okay. Because I think that's the kind of feedback where it'd be like, okay, no, it's either that kind of model is going to work, or there's some gaps that we need to think about further.
Awesome. So originally I had suggested that this discussion be time boxed to 25 minutes, and we have blown like way past that, which is great because it's been a really good discussion. Unless there's like any final points on this, I want to see if we can hit one or maybe two more points before we adjourn. Nope. Okay, cool. So the other, another kind of key piece is the proposal requirements. So the list from the CNCF is quite long, and this is for reference. The type of information that a project should submit to the CPC in order to be accepted or evaluated for acceptance into the foundation. And there was a pretty long list that was, I think, mostly specific to the CNCF, but there were some other ideas there. And the question to the group is whether whether we want to truncate that list a great deal, or whether we want to adopt different metrics for evaluation. I'll see if I can get a direct link to that list. I should have done that before, sorry.
And to be clear, this is requirements for being a top-level project?
No, this is the information that we request in order to process a application into the foundation. I don't think it's requirements for a specific category, but rather just entry-level requirements to the foundation in general.
Okay.
And there was one actually, I think, Chris, that you raised that was like, you know, we require you to be able to list the projects on your, or the companies that use your project on the webpage. So let me just pop in this to the Zoom link really quick. And if you go to the heading that says project proposal requirements, this is what we're talking about. Is there any, if you're taking a look, just evaluate fairly quickly if there's any information that you think we shouldn't be asking for, or if there's any information that you think we need to be measuring a certain way. You know, for example, community size, that's one that's kind of like, well, how do you want to measure that?
So some things that I think could easily be measured for projects coming in, I guess maybe whether or not it's a measure, but like adoption is one that we may want to consider to an extent. Community guidelines, I think, would be a huge one. Like if we want to think about the culture of our foundation, and I know that like it starts getting into culture fit, which is a bit of a loaded term, but you know, one of the questions that we had coming up is like, should there be a joint foundation code of conduct or any expectations around conduct guidelines? So, you know, does the project have a code of conduct? Do they have moderation guidelines? Are they willing to adopt them? And, you know, what are their, like, do people think that that's reasonable expectations for a project looking to join the foundation?
I mean, I think that a minimum code of conduct and then anything that is additional to that is reasonable. Like people can have or projects can have a more strict code of conduct. I think that there does have to be some enforced code of conduct to some extent.
The JSF, when Mocha joined, they required us to adopt their code of conduct. I don't know if there are exceptions to that rule, but as far as I know, all JSF projects have the JSF code of conduct.
That is true. Our projects all have the JSF code of conduct, although they do have the ability to adopt their own code of conduct. That's an option that they have. Nobody has taken that option. But
Now the flip side of that, though, is that code of conducts that are not actually moderated or enforced are arguably worse than no code of conduct. So I think there's also the question about a project's ability or willingness to enforce a code of conduct.
Was there discussion here about like our, at the JSF, there is a conduct committee for the foundation. So that takes the judgment away from the projects. There aren't a lot of places where we try to centralize things, but I think when you're trying to deal with conduct issues, it does help to have some neutral third parties doing the work.
Which chart, like where is that worked into the charter?
Let me find you a
that's not something I think we've had in any of the wording we've been talking about, but it might be a good idea to consider.
I think there certainly should be a code of conduct specifically called out. Again, they don't have to use the foundation's one if that's, you know, if we want to give people the flexibility, but that code of conduct would need to be approved, I think, before we accepted them, so that we don't end up with, an ineffective one. Or if their code of conduct is basically, you know, whatever these three people say at the top of the project,
yeah,
you know, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, we've seen this happen before in projects where, the people who are like the committers decide not to, take action against someone because he's a committer or she's a committer. And I don't think that's a very good pattern to follow.
Yeah, that's why it's interesting if in the language base, both, also for the setup of that council or whatever you called it.
Is there something in our Bootstrap documents that says the foundation is responsible for enforcement?
That's where I don't think we have anything that we. That's an area that we probably need to. There is in the CPC charter. There's like a line or two, but if we want something that's mirroring closer, if we should probably discuss what the JSF had and then see if it makes sense to incorporate that somewhere. Which is why I was asking where in the JSF charters does that fit?
Let me dig. Let me see. Conduct.
If we do this, it makes sense to, if somebody wants to bring in their own code of conduct, I mean, maybe it makes sense to kind of foist the enforcement onto that project if they want to have their custom thing. I don't know.
I think it's a matter of you want a consistent escalation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at the bottom of the section I just posted in there, it specifically calls out code of conduct. Given that if we have a foundation-wide conduct committee, I would much rather delegate any judgment and enforcement to that group. Again, there aren't a lot of places where I think it's appropriate to centralize things, but this really seems like one to me because it is something that's difficult to do objectively when you are participating deeply in a project like that.
So I think I'm certainly +1 to Dave, what you're saying. I just want to tie this back to the application process for the project. What we're looking to assess is whether, if I'm a new project and I'm applying to bring my project to the foundation, are we looking to assess that they have a COC period or that they are interested in bringing a COC? Like, how does this tie into that application process, I guess?
Hey, folks. I just want to jump in and say, if we are expecting projects to enforce code of conduct, we should be giving them the tools they need to do that. Most projects don't have experience dealing with this, especially once it only becomes a thing for them once, say, they're accepting our terms where they'd have to have a code of conduct. So giving them enforcement training should, it's a good opportunity now to build that into, say, the application process, that to join, they would have to go through that, because then that gap won't exist and they won't be able to say later on that, well, we don't know how, or we would be able to trust that they would handle it well based on the training we are giving them. I've just seen other projects where it's just by the time you think about needing this training, stuff has already happened, and it's more like putting out the fire as opposed to being prepared for it.
I completely agree with that. I think that's also why having people who are good at dealing with conflict resolution rather than good at writing code are probably better suited to this, because training, trying to require people to go through a lot of training in advance, even that often doesn't achieve the goal you want. But obviously it's a group decision to what to do there. But I think we can all identify situations when it didn't work out very well. I'm not sure what, looking at postmortems on those events, whether some training would have helped or not.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if some projects will perhaps, in terms of first line, tracking of issues and all that. I'm not sure that the foundation is going to be able to watch all of that and do that level. But So I think, we probably need the flexibility for at least a project who wants to do that part themselves to be able to do that. But then if that doesn't go right, having having the separate body that things can be reported to and handled and escalated, like as an independent third party, is what makes sense to me.
Are there any circumstances that we're aware of where a project who's a member of a broader project has wanted to have their own? Is this a common thing? It's something I haven't seen before, but I'm just wondering if anybody else has experienced this.
Well, I'm thinking of like Node, for example, where not necessarily having their own code of conduct, but like, there's a team of people who actually, pay attention to all of the issues. There's hundreds, if not multi-hundreds of issues every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you think that, that somebody from that code of conduct committee would actually be following all of that and chiming in where there's issues.
Yeah.
Because that's the level where I could see the project still managing that as the first line, right? And then it's like, okay, well, wait a sec. If there's something that happens there that people don't agree with, or the right things aren't happening, then I can see it can go to then going to like a separate committee. But maybe, I don't know, like what happens in the JSF today? Is there active monitoring and participation, or is it, what's the model that's followed?
So I'll just point out, because Ben also pointed out that it's time, but to answer your question super quick, it's not active monitoring, it's reactive monitoring, and that if a project has an issue, they bring it to they can bring it to the code of conduct team for response, but the code of conduct team itself is not, watching all the repos and that
right.
kind of.
Right, and that seems to me the logical division, right? And there must be like hopefully a documented process that somebody, say, from outside the project could follow to contact the Code of Conduct Committee with something.
Yeah. So we should probably close so that our friends can move on to their other busy days. We've got a meeting at 2 for the merge meeting. And I think there's one clear or a couple of clear action items as a result of this meeting, which is just to start working on that open governance definition. We can also start to put together the this sort of COC connection with the charter and the CPC and like what that looks like a little bit more. Does somebody want to take the task of maybe start opening issues on those in the Bootstrap repo? Does that make sense? I'm happy to do it too, but I just want to make sure I follow a process that other people make sense too.
I'm happy if you open the issues and then we can chime in.
Sounds good.
Once we see what they are, maybe you can get some other people to sort of volunteer to lead them too. But
yeah,
just opening them would be a great first step.
Okie doke. Right, I don't entirely know what happens next because somebody else is hosting the meeting. So,
I was just going to say, if someone could document the action items, I have to jump to a meeting. That would be awesome.
Got it.
Thank you, Jory. Really appreciate it. Y'all are great. It's been a good meeting.
Likewise. Okay, thanks everybody.
Talk to you later.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.